It's very nice to welcome you back to our Gatty lectures, season of academic year 2021. I'm very pleased to have here my wonderful co-host, Kara Guz, my colleague, Emily Donald, and our esteemed speaker, Patrick Jory. My name is Anna Kasheva, and I'm a co-host of the Gatty 2021. I'm a student of Asian Studies Department here at Cornell. My role in research is visual culture of Laos during the Cold War period, but that should not concern you today. Our talk will be approximately 45 minutes, and we will have time to have a Q&A session at the end of it. And because we're using the Zoom webinar, which is not necessarily the most common format you have for Zoom meetings, so how it works is that unfortunately we cannot see your faces and we cannot allow audience to speak at any random time because it is quite a big audience. What we have instead is the chat function, which you see on your right-hand side. So feel free to put messages there. You can also chat between yourselves if you wish. But for your questions to the speaker, we actually would ask you to use the Q&A tab, which is a separate tab from the chat. And so it will be 45 minutes, and then it will be some time for Q&A. And without any further ado, let me introduce my colleague, Emily Donald, who is a PhD student here at History Department of Cornell. So Emily studies construction of normative sexuality and queer personhood in 20th century Thailand. She knows Patrick Jory very, very well because Patrick Jory is her former supervisor from her study at University of Queensland. And so let me hand over to Emily to introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Anna. Hi, everyone. I have the delightful task of introducing today's speaker, Dr. Patrick Jory, who is joining us. He's joining us live from my hometown of Brisbane, Australia. As Anna mentioned, Patrick was my advisor in college and was actually the person who encouraged me to come to Cornell. I can't speak for my colleagues and current advisors, but I'm very grateful that he did, and for all the downsides that that moving our lives online entails. I'm very grateful that CEEP's virtual platform has made it possible for Patrick to share his scholarship with us today. Patrick teaches Southeast Asian history at the University of Queensland. He is the author of Thailand's Theory of Monarchy, the Vasantara Jataka, and the Idea of the Perfect Man, which has recently been translated into Thai. You can find his publications in a variety of journals, including Critical Asian Studies, Sojourn, Southeast Asia Research Journal, and the Journal of Southeast Asian Studies. In his Gatty lecture today, which is titled A History of Manners and Civility in Thailand, the Civilizing Process in a Southeast Asian Society, Patrick he's giving us a glimpse, a very exciting glimpse into his forthcoming book by showing how Norbert Elias's influential civilization process paradigm can throw light on the history of manners in Thailand. So I'll leave it there and hand it over to you, Patrick. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Emily, for that very kind introduction. First, let me say it's a great honour to be invited to present a lecture in the Ronald and Janette Gatty series here at Cornell University. It's an especially important occasion for me because my PhD supervisor, Craig Reynolds, did his doctoral studies at Cornell in the Southeast Asia program. And his supervisor, Oliver Walters, was a professor there for many years as well. I'm also really, really proud that one of my former students at the University of Queensland, Emily Donald, is now doing her PhD at Cornell in the Department of History. So even though I've never been there, never been to Cornell, but I feel I have a connection to it. Let me also thank all of the audience that this new amazing technology has made possible. I think, the people sort of Zooming in or webinaring in from around the world. So thank you for listening. So what I want to do today is to present a summary of a research project that I've just finished, to the extent that you ever really finish a a research project that will be published next year under the title A History of Manners and Civility in Thailand. So what I want to do is to explain how I became interested in this subject, why I think it's important, why I think manners are an important thing to study, the approach that I took in the book in writing about this subject, and what my conclusions were. Now, one of the things that I guess you could say attracted me to Southeast Asia, and I think I'm not the only one. There are things outside of academia that kind of attract you to the region, are the kind of the general good manners that I felt I encountered there. And I actually was reading Tony Reid's book, Southeast Asia, Critical Crossroads, is that what it's called? Published in 2015. And in the last chapter, I was happy to see that he also mentioned this value of civility that he felt was prominent, throughout Southeast Asia. So that kind of something that attracted me, but I never thought about it in a scholarly way. I guess I just thought it was, part of the culture, and I didn't think it could be the subject of an academic study. Then one day, a few years ago, I came across a very famous Thai manners guy. I think all Thai people would know it, Sombat Kompudi, which I've translated as Qualities of a Gentle Person, written by a guy called Jalpaya Pasadet Surendra Tibeti, who was a descendant of King Rama II. That's why he's got such a long title, and an advisor to King Chulalongkorn on education. It was published in 1900. And I think you could say it's the most famous Thai manners manual. It's still in print today. And reading through this book, I could see that many of the forms of manners that I previously thought were just part of the culture actually had been laid out in quite some detail in this manual in a prescriptive fashion. And as I looked into the subject a bit more, I discovered a really huge literature on manners and comportment, going back really 200 years, if not more, which includes Buddhist canonical texts and commentaries, court poetry, and works dealing with courtly conduct, manners on etiquette, educational curricula, textbooks, novels, and not to mention government edicts about how to behave. So I could see this as a subject that a lot of people were interested in. And I also began to see that at times of political change or political crisis, your discussions of manners and morality tend to become quite intense. So, for example, whenever there's a military coup, the new coup group always introduces a new set of manners and morality, including the latest group. So it started to become clear to me that manners and the broader question of how to conduct oneself has been one of the key questions of the 20th century. Another thing that struck me was that reading through these works by different people written at different periods of time, it became clear to me that notions of good manners and civility have changed over time. So when you see that, you automatically see, I can see now that there is a history that you can write about that, because you can identify change in the sources that you're using. So the obvious question was, why have these things changed over time? So put very simplistically, what I'm trying to do is to adapt some of some aspects of the approach of the famous sociologist Norbert Elias for the history of manners in Western Europe to Thai history. And I should say also that for a while I've been, I guess, a little bit not impatient is not really the right word, but I think Southeast Asian studies for a long time has been quite maybe sort of inwardly focused, and we maybe have been a little bit not as ready to do comparative stuff with other places as we might do. I work in a history department. I don't work in an Asian studies department, and no one's really interested in Thailand or Southeast Asia here, despite my best efforts. So when I talk to people, I kind of feel that I have to engage with their, I guess, mental worldview, which tends to be very, very Eurocentric, particularly here in Australia. So I wanted to, so that automatically got me thinking more along comparative lines. So I kind of like the idea of looking, okay, Elias is writing about Western Europe, you know, this, I can sort of see this change in manners in Thailand. What are the similarities? What are the differences? What are the similarities? Now, one of the key, well, really the central theme of the book is the central figure of the Pudi. If you don't remember anything about this talk, try and remember this term, the Pudi, or gentle person. Literally, it means good person, but I think gentle person is a better translation. And I argue in the book that the Pudi really helped shape what I call the Thai national habitus for a century. If I can just show you if I can share my screen now, just for a minute. So, okay, I hope you can see that over there, wherever you are. So this is a story from, I think, when was it? March last year. And we see the then Commander-in-Chief, General Apirat Kongsompong. He just retired, I think it was last week, was it? The week before. Now he's, I think, Deputy Secretary of the Bureau of the Royal Household. So very loyal servant to the throne. And here he is making a pledge to an oath of loyalty to King Chulalongkorn. And as part of his speech, he says, Rami Sombat Kompudi, Rami Sombat Pudi. Basically, he just echoes the words of that manners textbook I mentioned to you, the manners manual, qualities of a gentleman. So we can see, at least within the leadership of the Royal Thai Army, these ideas are still very current. Now I'll just go back, if I could, to my visage. If we can, thank you. So the book really is about the rise and the fall of the Pudi, the rise and the fall of the Pudi. That's what my book is about. I try to downplay personalities, political events. I'm a bit of an analyst on events, actually. I'm a bit more of a structure guy. Ideologies and institutions. These aren't so important in this book. The main character, if you like, the main character of this book is conduct. That's what I'm focusing on. And it's a story of how conduct changes over time and why. And what I really want to do is to connect the history of the way that individuals manage their bodies, manage their speech, and manage their thinking, to connect that with the big social, economic, and political changes in Thailand over the last 2 centuries. So, okay, so the details are in the book. We've only got a short time. So rather than go into the details, I'll try and sort of sketch out, to the best of my ability, my overall argument. So it starts, the key sort of turning point really is the late 19th and early 20th century. The Thai court under King Chulalongkorn carries out a series of reforms to the manpower system by which labour in the kingdom is organised. Now, prior to this reform, peasants and slaves were legally bound to, or owned, in the case of slaves, to their lords, their Jao in Thai. And they were required to perform labour service to them for a certain number of months in the year. In actual practice, this system had started to break down during the 19th century. Many of the peasants, paid a fee to avoid the required compulsory labour service, and the length of service, the period of service. These are the trials of this technology we're using. Okay, let me get back to my point. Okay, so what I was talking about was these labour power reforms had a profound effect on the economic status of these aristocratic families. A lot of them fall on hard times. Quite a few of these families, they had to sell their land and their property to kind of maintain the standard of living to which they had become accustomed. And as we know, after 1932, the revolution of 1932, this class also lost political power. Another important factor, interesting factor that decided the fate of the aristocracy, if you like, is the decline of the practice of polygamy, which is finally legally banned after 1932, but in fact it had been in decline for a few decades before that. And this led to an absolute decline in the numbers of people related to these aristocratic families. So the change to the manpower system and the economic decline of the Thai upper class, and indeed the political the end of their political power after 1932, it profoundly affects the sense of identity of this class. If they could no longer command labour as a legal right, what did it mean to be a lord, to be a Zhao? Okay, now, so at about the same time, the Thai court carries out two other major reforms. Firstly, the expansion of a royal bureaucracy throughout the kingdom, and secondly, the creation of a modern standing army. And the king, King Chulalongkorn, appoints, and his successor, King Macharawut, appoint aristocrats, often their own brothers or relatives, to head most of the departments and bureaus in the bureaucracy, as well as the key positions in the military. But this is the key point: the rank and file members of the bureaucracy and the armed forces, these guys are commoners, they're educated commoners. And this bureaucracy expands very rapidly from just over, I think it's 12,000 or something in 1890 to about 80,000 in 1920. And so what happens is there is a escalating tension between aristocrats and commoners, due really to this competition in the bureaucracy and the military. Now, the academic scholarship on this period is very well known. People like Nakarin, Copeland, Barmaid Gulladar and others, they've documented this tension pretty well. Commoners resent the arrogance and the born to rule mentality of the aristocrat generals and department heads, and the fact that these aristocrats owed their position not to merit but to their bloodline. The aristocrats, for their part, they resented the ambition, what they perceived to be a lack of respect, and even a jealousy about their better education in many cases of these uppity commoners. So all these resentments really come to a head with the 1932 revolution. This is the key point: the weakening and eventual disappearance of the aristocracy from its leadership role in Thai society led to profound questions about manners and conduct. And what the book argues is that it also in turn leads to the emergence of a new ideal of exemplary conduct embodied in the figure of the Pudi, the gentle person. So in a way, the gentle person, the Pudi, replaces the Zhao, replaces the old aristocracy. And my argument is that Thai society has been dominated by this Pudi class since this time up until the present, although its hold on the present is getting increasingly shaky. Okay, a few words about manners and habitus. So when we think about manners, particularly as a historian, I guess, there's a tendency, I think, to think about, how you behave at the dining table, how you hold your knife and fork, when to say please and thank you and excuse me and all these kinds of things. That is, nothing really particularly important in the scheme of things when when most historians are looking at questions of power and violence and these bigger questions. So manners kind of might seem to be a little trivial. My understanding of manners is, I think, a lot deeper than that. What I'm really referring to is what sociologists refer to as habitus. Now, this idea goes back to Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas in the Middle Ages, and it's sort of been revived by the European sociologists of the early 20th century, people like Durkheim, Weber, Morse, and later Norbert Elias. Now, in this sense, manners mean habitus. Habitus means second nature. The deep kind of automatic and enduring disposition in the way that one acts, the way that one speaks, and the way that one thinks. And history is crucial to the formation of habitus. Marcel Mauss described habitus as the effect of the way, and I quote, "the way that history and society, social ranks included, are inscribed upon our bodies and are daily performed by us." Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, a bit more recent, described habitus in a similar way, and I quote, "a political mythology, realised, embodied, turned into a permanent disposition, a durable manner of speaking, of standing, speaking, and thereby of feeling and thinking. For Norbert Elias, habitus was, and I quote, an inner automatism, the imprint of society on the inner self. Okay, so that's the sociological conception of habitus. But if you look at the Thai literature on manners, there's a remarkably similar conception to the sociological conception of habitus. Now, much of the Thai literature echoes an older Buddhist doctrine about how to master the self, about self-control. And this doctrine divides instruction on conduct up into three categories. Gai, Waja, Jai. I think all people will know this phrase, Gai, Waja, Jai. Body, speech, and mind. Whenever there's discussions of morality in Thai, everyone will come back to this phrase, Gai, Waja, Jai. So there's a very old discourse of conduct in Buddhism that teaches self-restraint. The emphasis is always on self-restraint in one's bodily actions, in how one speaks and how one thinks. And in fact, in the Patimokkha, these 227 rules that the monks have to recite regularly, there's a whole section called the Sekya. I think it's about 76 rules, which are all about manners, basically, for monks. So instruction in manners, in this broader sense, is really about how to control the whole self. I think this is a really important idea. It's about how to control the whole self. It's not just about ideology, which is this thing kind of floating around in the idealist ether. It's about controlling body, speech, and mind. Now, whether you look at it from a Buddhist point of view about, how to reach, nirvana, or if you think about it in a more sort of sinister way, in terms of a political agenda to control people, I think this is a really important concept to think about. Now, precisely at the time that these reforms that I've just described were being carried out, King Chulalongkorn's one of his right-hand men on educational affairs, this guy, Jalpiya Prasadit Surendrathipati, he published his Qualities of a Gentleman. And let me just, I hope I can share the screen again. I hope I don't drop out, but if I can bring this up would be good. Okay, can you see that? I hope you can. So here's Jalpiya Prasadit. And it becomes the most popular manners manual, as I mentioned. So it's really aimed at training young men to enter the royal bureaucracy. It's later taught at co-educational schools throughout the kingdom, and you can sort of see I've put up here some editions of this book right up to 1999, and there are editions going up even further to closer to the present. So the manners literature is quite clear from this earlier period that the Pudi initially refers just to men, the guys who are going to the bureaucracy, but later on it's extended to men and women. And the manners literature tends to look at both men and women at the same time as Pudi. So for the next 50 years or so after its publication, there's this huge interest in the question of manners. Kings, princes, nobles, prime ministers, senior monks, active as well as retired army generals, politicians, poets, novelists, teachers, educational administrators, journalists, etc. They produce this corpus of literature that sets out models of appropriate behaviour. And as I said earlier, it's very prescriptive. So, for example, it teaches such things as how you stand, how you walk, how you sit, how you pay homage, how you prostrate yourself and crawl in the presence of high status people, how you sleep, how you eat, how you manage bodily functions, how you dress, how you pay respect to superiors, how you deal with inferiors, how you socialise, how you use your time, how you work and how you play. It really covers pretty much everything, the whole gamut of social activities. And for all of these writers, the central question is, what is a Pudi? What is a gentle person? And the most important point that writer after writer emphasises is that no matter what your social background was, no matter whether you were an aristocrat or you were a commoner, no matter whether you came from a good family, Dragundi, or not, and the most important thing was having an education and your manners. They state this time and time again. You've got to have good manners and an education. Now, the concept of Pudi is not unknown in Thai scholarship, cultural history, I guess. Sometimes it's been talked about as being a mixture of the Victorian gentleman and Buddhist ideas. And viewed sort of superficially, it's true that you can see Victorian and Buddhist conceptions in the description of how to behave in qualities of gentleman. After all, it's written, at the tail end of the Victorian period, and Thailand is really drawn, Siam at the time is really drawn into the British Empire. Jaupiar Pasadeb, this guy, and he spends quite a bit of time in England looking after the princes, and also looking after, he was a guardian to Crown Prince Vajiralwood. So he understood Victorian England quite well, and obviously got some ideas from there. But I don't think that this is the right way to see it. I don't think it's to see this as Victorian influence. It's more a case of what Norbert Elias describes in his classic work, The Civilizing Process. And let me, if I can share the next slide. Okay, I hope you can see that. What Norbert Elias describes in his classic work, The Civilizing Process, as, quote, he describes it as the courtisation of the bourgeois and the bourgeoisisation of the courtly people. I'll just repeat that again because it's an important concept. The courtisation of the bourgeois and the bourgeoisisation of courtly people. That is, the ideal of the Pudi is a hybrid of Thai courtly conduct and bourgeois behaviour. It's a hybrid of two different habitus, and it reflects the struggle between, and also the interdependence on, and interdependence, this is a key concept in Elias, the interdependence of two classes, a declining aristocracy, which is trying to hold on to its identity, and a rising educated bourgeois class. And you have to understand that the habitus of these two classes is really different due to the different function of these two classes. So, courtly people, they're incessantly preoccupied with status. Their whole lives revolve around status. It defines their social existence, their conception of who they are. And in this struggle for status, the relationship with the king is crucial, since, as Elias describes it, the king is the most important factor in the distribution of status opportunities, okay, to courtly people. The lives of bourgeois people, by contrast, are bound up with the world of work. So courtly people don't have to work. They have other people working for them. Bourgeois people actually have to work. They have to work, and they've got to attune their behaviour to the market, okay? Courtly people are much less involved in the market, at least not in the same way that bourgeois people are. So put simplistically, where courtly people are bound up in the struggle for status opportunities, bourgeois people struggle for economic opportunities. Now, in the Civilizing Process, Elias describes this struggle which took place in Europe. It takes place over centuries. In Thailand, the same struggle takes place really over the course of the 20th century. And that's why I think this sociological literature is so appropriate for Thailand, because it was really talking about a similar process in Europe that is happening in Thailand over the course of the 20th century. So if we understand, this is an important point, if we understand manners and conduct and civility in this way, we can see that what has become, understood as Thai manners, which kind of suggests some transcendent essence of Thai cultural identity that comes from some weird, Buddhist idea or weird Buddhist doctrine. It's really nothing of the sort. Rather, it's a product of a struggle between two classes for supremacy. And so debates about the Pudi reflect this struggle between the two classes. Debates about manners reflects this struggle. So if you look at the literature over the 20th century, there are lots of different perspectives, but you can kind of divide them up into kind of two groups. So writers, the more conservative writers on manners, who often have a courtly background, they might be aristocrats or they might have grown up in or around one of the royal courts. They don't deny that commoners could become pudi. Like I said, everyone says anyone can become a pudi, but the conservative writers tend to emphasise the importance of the inherited qualities of the pudi, coming from a good family. Yeah, it's important. It's not necessary, but it's important. And also, what is also important is the Buddhist concept of karma. That is, the actions that you carried out in your former lifetime, which have results in this lifetime. So if you're a bad person in your former lifetime, that's why you're a peasant in this lifetime. So even though they kind of they're forced to accept the concept of the pudi, they have a very conservative take on it, and it tends to be like a courtly version, a courtly interpretation of the pudi. Respect is really important in their works. They always spend a lot of time talking about respect for superiors. And here I'm thinking of people like some of the famous manners writers, people like Praya Anopapdraipop, Momracha Wongkukrit Bamot, everyone knows him, Dok Mai Sot, the famous novelist, probably Thailand's most famous novelist, Kunying Tutsidi Malagun Nayutiya. You may not have heard of her. She's very important. She was a lady-in-waiting, I believe, of Queen Rampai Pani, the queen of King Rama VII. And she was also the wife of Momluang bin Malakun, who was the long-time Minister of Education during the Sarit period, during the long conservative period. So she was a very powerful woman. Momluang Bunlua Tep Suwan was another one, Dog Maisot's sister, who is a subject of quite a sympathetic biography written by Susan Kepner, published a couple of years ago. So they're the conservative ones. The more progressive writers on manners and good behaviour, they're usually commoners, and they emphasise that no matter what your background is, anyone can become a pudi. It's really front and centre of their work, and they tend to favour much more egalitarian and more universal forms of manners. And here we can refer to the famous Supat Burut group of writers that came together in the 1920s and were very influential over subsequent decades. The writer, a former teacher, a guy called Praya Warawitpisan, the novelist Gos Rankanang, very famous Thai novelist, the politician turned manners writer, a confidant of Bidi Phnom Yong, Tawi Bunyaked, who was Prime Minister very briefly at the end of World War II. Gritsana Tewarak, one of the Supat group writers, a prolific guy who wrote on manners and conduct. So these are the more progressive writers. So one of the central arguments of the book is that changes in manners and civility in Thailand are driven internally by what Elias calls these relations of interdependence, rather than externally by Western influence. It's driven internally by this tension and interdependence between the courtly and the bourgeois class, not by Western influence. That's another key point in the book. Okay, so let me say a little bit more about Norbert Elias. He's been used a lot for Europe and the US. Interestingly also for Latin America, where he's quite popular, much less so for Asia. There have been a few people who've tried. For my liking, these references tend to be a little tokenish, with some exceptions. In my work, for better or for worse, for good or for bad, I've used his approach quite heavily. It's just struck me reading this book, when you, for example, there's so many similarities, it seemed to me, to debates about manners and conduct in Thailand. For example, when you read Elias's description of court society, the court society of King Louis XIV, okay, you could almost be reading about the royal court under King Chulalongkorn, or even King Bhumibol for that matter. The descriptions are very similar. So all of these things made me feel that rather than understanding Thai manners in terms of cultural difference, which almost always that's the way these things are talked about, we should understand manners, that is, in the way that I'm talking about it, these ideal notions of how one should act, speak and think. We should understand this as a variation of the same process of change in conduct that Elias describes in the Civilizing Process. So I promised in the abstract to talk about my schema of periodization in understanding the history of manners in Thailand. So that's what I want to talk about now. What I've done in the book is to divide the history of manners, Thailand's history. I guess it's 2 centuries, okay? So it's a long period of time. It's a what they call a longitudinal study. And I deliberately did that. I wanted to see this change over long periods of time rather than just sort of focusing on one period, not knowing or being interested in what came before or after. So it's really over 200 years, perhaps with a focus on the last 150. So I've divided up into 4 periods. Firstly, what I've called the age of colonialism and absolutism. Secondly, the age of revolution, channeling my inner Eric Hobsbawm. Thirdly, the age of reaction. And fourthly, the age of development and democratization. Now, I think using this periodization schema, we can identify some of the same themes that are central to Elias's explanation of the transformation of manners. You can see the same things happening. For example, the establishment of what Elias calls monopolies of the use of force, the role of courtly society with its highly refined code of manners, increasing economic complexity during the colonial period, leading to a rising degree of interdependence between different social groups, the rise of the bourgeoisie and its long struggle for supremacy with the aristocracy. All of these things which you see in Elias, they're there, I think, in the Thai case as well. So let me go over briefly each of these periods. Firstly, the age of colonialism and absolutism begins about the middle of the 19th century. Siam is drawn out of the orbit of the Chinese Empire. We should never forget that Siam was a tributary, a very old actually, tributary state of the Chinese Empire. The Bowring Treaty of 1855 really kind of was the death knell to the tributary system, and that was, I think they sent their last tributary mission to China in 1852. They never sent another one. So they're drawn out of the economic orbit of China and into the economic orbit of the British Empire and a much more globalized economy. And during this period, we see, of course, the consolidation of a true, absolute monarchy in Siam. So, the rise of absolutism in Thailand corresponds to the development of what Elias calls power monopolies in Europe during the era of absolutism. Elias spends a lot of time talking about absolutism in Europe and the effect that it had on manners, behaviour, morality, and these things. In the 1890s, as we know, the government sets up a royal bureaucracy modelled on the colonial administrations of British India and the Dutch East Indies, led by, as I mentioned earlier, princes and nobles, but also including large numbers of commoners, whom Gulladar refers to as bourgeois bureaucrats. I like that term. I think it's a very useful term, bourgeois bureaucrats. And during this same period, the Thai court attempts to develop new standards of behaviour which are appropriate for the royal bureaucracy. So the target group are the bureaucrats, okay, for this first spurt of manners manuals. And so we see a flourishing of manners manuals and textbooks written by court figures, sometimes princes, sometimes nobles. They're all around the court, really for bureaucrats to train members of the bureaucracy. And what the aim is, you can see, it's easy to see, this is all empirical stuff. They're trying to rein in the feudal excesses of the aristocracy, which is coming from their birthright. So they say like some things, you can't go around assaulting people. You can't just take a woman and use for your own pleasure. Obviously, because this is what these guys were doing in the past. You can't do that anymore. And they're trying to introduce middle-class notions of personal responsibility. This is a big one, personal responsibility, honesty. The whole debate about honesty is very interesting. Sociability, industriousness. We can see that the Weber's work ethic, the Protestants' ethic coming in here. Good work habits, punctuality, the rational use of time. You've got to arrive at the office on time. You've got to do your work. Don't be lazy. Don't be selfish. you've got to give more attention to self-presentation, got to give attention to the way you dress. These things are important. And importantly, really importantly, you have to consider the feelings of other people, regardless of social rank. Now, of course, we think we don't even think about this, but they have to spell this out in these manuals time and time again, because you've got aristocrats who are working with commoners. You've got to treat them like your colleagues, not like your slaves or your serfs. Okay. So the outcome of this, I've made the point already, is that you have this interdependence between aristocracy and this rising class of bourgeois bureaucrats. That's where this literature on manners comes out in this early period. The second period, the Age of Revolution. Almost as soon as the absolutist state is established in Siam, you get opposition to it. And really this begins what I've called the Age of Revolution, starting from the early 20th century, lasting really up until the end of the Second World War, or 1950 maybe. 1911, the Chinese Revolution sweeps away 2,500 years of monarchy in China. The following year, there's a failed plot to overthrow the Thai Monarchy. People don't know this, actually, that they drew straws who was going to assassinate the king. They were actually talking about this. Luckily for the king, they discovered this plot in time, and the conspirators were arrested and jailed. But as we know, 20 years later, there's the revolution, and the People's Party succeeds in overthrowing the absolute monarchy. And this ushers in a really, as we know, an anti-royalist period. The king eventually abdicates, flees to Britain. Quite a few of the aristocrats also go into exile. Some of them are imprisoned. The People's Party go really full, anti-royalist. The new young king and his family, they go into exile effectively in Switzerland. And basically, interestingly, Thailand at this time is basically a republic in all but name. Okay, so corresponding to this critique of absolutism, and it happens a long way before 1932, by the way, we witness a reaction against courtly forms of conduct and the growing popularity of more egalitarian middle-class rules of social interaction. So you have all of these Thai writers now. They're not court figures, some of them are, but most of them aren't court figures. They're commoners. They're writing about manners and conduct and how to be civilized. Also, interestingly, they're interested in Western works on manners and etiquette. And some of these works, I talk about them in the book, they include lots of books about the gentleman. Everyone's very interested in what, this idea of the gentleman. They're interested in manuals on looking after the home. Mrs. Beaton's Book of Household Management, it's one of the most famous books of the 19th century, is quite well known amongst the Thai upper class. Etiquette books for modern women, such as Mary Beery's Manners Made Easy, published in 1949. Emily Post's Etiquette in Society, Business, Politics and in the Home, published in 1922, very influential in Siam. Samuel Smiles' Self-Help, 1859. Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Half of that book was translated by Tui Bunyaket and published in his book. Another one, Ewing Webb and John Morgan's Strategy in Handling People. Interestingly, so the Thai, these writers and intellectuals, they're quite happy to borrow from this stuff. It's not like, we've got to protect Thai manners. It's how to be a civilized person, how to be a gentle person. Okay, so it appears at the end of, or during this Age of Revolution, it appears that the bourgeois notions of good behaviour have won the day. Not so fast, because this is followed by the Age of Reaction, which begins really from the end of World War II, and with the onset of the Cold War, that this progressive politics comes to an end, and we see, of course, the political fortunes of the People's Party go into decline, and eventually are dealt a death blow with the military coups of Field Marshal Seri Tanarat in 57 and 58. Meanwhile, the monarchy makes this remarkable revival, and with the monarchy, you get the restoration of royalist cultural norms, and with them conservative, courtly ideals of proper behaviour. And this time these are elevated as the standard, not just for bourgeois bureaucrats, but for the whole nation to emulate, for all Thai citizens, men and women. Interestingly, King Bhumibol, effectively over this period of time, he becomes the Pudi par excellence, I would argue. So this is the period when Thai manners is created. It's created in the reactionary period, and it's modelled on this very conservative, courtly interpretation of the Pudi. The key institution for inculcating these norms of behaviour was the national education system. The military regime and its royal supporters have total control over the education system. The education system expands markedly during this period. Basically, everyone now, up until at least, is going to get 4 years, if not 6 years of primary school education. Jalpia Prasadet's famous manners manual, Qualities of a Gentleperson, is republished by his daughter, and it's actually expanded to about 5 times its length to really, I guess, to explain it to a younger generation. But many of this revival of manners manuals are very conservative. These manners manuals are very conservative and somewhat anachronistic. So, for example, one of the most famous of these textbooks tells children that they should not abuse their slaves in front of other people. So you're really going back to the absolute monarchy. Okay, so this period, the Age of Reaction, is crucial for understanding how Thai manners becomes associated with the idea of civility, quam on nom. Civility, it's a key concept. It becomes a key idea in the official notion of Thai manners. And in this reactionary program of manners reform, the monarchy plays a crucial role. The monarchy's role is to normalise and validate the this revived courtly form of civility towards figures of authority, whether they're your parents, your teachers. Teachers, very important. If you think about what's going on today, okay, with this sort of almost, there's a sort of a social revolution in Thai schools taking place. This is where it comes from. Monks, the bureaucracy, the military, and the royal family itself. So the teaching manners become central to the construction of a culture of civility that's built up to legitimise the domination of the military, bureaucracy, and the monarchy since the late 1950s. And one manners manual of the era, not published in 1973 by a minor aristocrat, Mom Luang Pi Malagun, another Malagun, this very important family for the study of manners. If I can just show this slide, which was used to advertise the, promote the seminar. So this book is called Mariat Thai Manners. And what do we see there? We see a courtier who is in prostration. Okay, so Thai manners, you must be prostrate, you must be servile. And in the introduction to this book, what does B. Malagun say? He says, civility is a characteristic of the Thai people. Civility is a characteristic of the Thai people. Okay. So here are some other some images describing various forms of comportment that you have to practice to become a true Thai and practice Thai manners. So this is standing before the monarch. Here is one form of prostration. Here's another form of prostration. You can see not much difference, hardly any difference between male and female. And you can see the influence of these forms of comportment, really. Here we have former Prime Minister Yingluck Shinawatra. She's learned her manners pretty well, prostrating before Princess Sirintong. Okay, so that's the Age of Reaction. The last part of the book is what I've called the Age of Development and Democratization. It begins really with the policies of economic liberalisation in the early 1960s. As we know, Thailand experiences this long economic boom, lasting until the financial crisis of 1997. It's one of the fastest growing economies in the world. And as always, there's an expansion of the private sector, of the commercial sector, and there's corresponding growth of a middle class. But this time it's a middle class, a bourgeois class, if you like to use that term, but bourgeois I'd use kind of a bit earlier, really. It's outside of the royal bureaucracy. This is very important. It's a commercial middle class, not or a professional middle class, not a bureaucratic middle class. You get all the other changes that are taking place with the with economic modernisation. You know, an increasing generation gap, the spread of the mass media, the influence of initially socialist ideas, later on liberal ideas, but the liberal ideas are actually quite weak for a long time. And of course, this being the month of October, mass political participation, beginning with the student uprising in October 14th, 1973. So all of these changes challenge this conservative status quo, this cultural civility, this courtly interpretation of good manners that had grown up during the previous 3 or 4 decades. But it challenged it outside of the bureaucracy, the military, the schools and the universities. So all of this stuff is happening in the private sector, in the mass media, in popular culture. That's where all the more modern forms of manners and conduct and behaviour, that's where they are thriving. Back in the conservative bastions of Thai society, the bureaucracy, etc., the education system, you still have the influence of the courtly styles. And you can see the clash, really, I think, with the big political crisis that that started under Thaksin Shinawatra and is still taking place today. So really, the crisis between, or the conflict between Thaksin and the palace, one dimension, one aspect of that conflict is a immense pressure on the old courtly forms of behaviour. You know, Thaksin was always criticised as having bad manners, as did his supporters. So, but what this to me really suggests is that the figure of the Pudi, who had controlled Thai politics for so long, through the monarchy, the bureaucracy, and people, and the military, people like Brem. Brem is a classic Pudi, right? They're challenged by the entry of the rural and urban working classes into Thailand's politics and economy. Okay, so I'm coming to an end now. I know our time is running short. So where does this leave the courtly style of manners, the courtly style of behaviour? In the civilizing process, Elias argues that in every country which has had a powerful courtly style, which has had a powerful courtly society, courtly styles of conduct have a huge role in shaping modern manners. Now, what's distinctive about the Thai national habitus, particularly when we compare Thailand to other societies in Asia, is the enduring role of the monarchy. Thailand's monarchy, survives not only the challenges of the colonial period, but also the social revolutions that swept away the vestiges of courtly societies in other parts of Asia, during decolonisation and during the Cold War. And so there's this sense of continuity, which, okay, to a certain extent, it's artificially created, but there's a sense of continuity with the old absolutist regime, enhanced by the long reign of King Bhumibol. He's there from 1946 to 2016, 70 years, right? So that enhances a sense of continuity. So as a result, this means that these old the courtly styles have been nurtured and sustained in Thailand to a much greater extent for much longer than anywhere else, I would argue, in Asia. Nonetheless, you can't deny that the courtly style has been challenged, or at least attenuated, by middle-class modes of behaviour. And more recently, what the Dutch sociologist Cas Wouters calls informalisation. That is, people start to become much more relaxed, much more informal in their manners. And that's partly a result of the entry of the rural and urban working class into Thai society, particularly into the national economy, and with Thaksin into national politics. Another reason, okay, this is important too, another reason why courtly modes of conduct have survived for so long, I think, is the peculiar nature of Thailand's middle class. Now, for much of the 20th century, Thailand's middle class has been divided between a royal bureaucracy, the Karachagans, originally created by the Absolute Monarchy, and which still sees its ultimate loyalty to the throne. That's where they see that's where their loyalty lies. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, you have an ethnic Chinese or Sino-Thai commercial middle class, which has expanded greatly since the 1960s, but which for a long time has as elsewhere in Southeast Asia, not to the same extent, but as elsewhere, has felt insecure about its status in Thailand. And this is one of the reasons I argue that, why more middle class styles of conduct in Thailand have really failed to elevate themselves to a dominant position. What I would say is that, the historic tensions, they're not really there now, but I think, you don't, under the surface, you can still see, I think they're still there. Historical tensions between the Thai and Chinese, Thai and Chinese tends to be understood in ethnic terms, okay? I think it ought to be better understood as differences in conduct between courtly conduct, which is dominated by the bureaucracy and kind of ethnic Thai, and the bourgeois or middle class habitus, which is dominated by people of ethnic Chinese ancestry. So it's really not so much an ethnic conflict; it's a conflict between habituses, between the courtly and the commercial middle class habitus. So the weak and divided nature of Thailand's middle class means that courtly ideals of good manners, which prize the expression of gentility, servility, deference, calmness, softness, imperturbability, all these things that are characteristic of the courtier, which are embodied in the figure of the Pudi. That's why these things have for so long been the standard by which good behaviour is judged. And right towards the end of the book, I make a few observations as to why I think the Pudi style of conduct is now in terminal decline. But we've run out of time. So I'll just leave you with 3 final points. In conclusion, I get 3 things I hope you'll take away from this paper. Firstly, I hope I've tried to do the best job I can in trying to convince you of the importance of manners, but understood in these Buddhist terms as control of the body, speech and mind. If you can try and remember that, control of the body, speech and mind. I think it's a very powerful idea. As habitus, the importance of this idea for understanding Thailand's modern history. Secondly, the argument, I guess the main argument, that is the Pudi, the gentle person, really supersedes the aristocrat as the ideal embodiment of ideal behaviour in Thailand in the 20th century. And thirdly, that Thailand's distinctive modern history, not culture, history, means that courtly styles of conduct have endured longer there than in other countries. And it's due to lots of things, but in particular the role of the monarchy, the weakness of the middle class, and the relatively late entry of the rural and urban working class into the national economy and national politics. Sorry for going a little bit over time, but I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening in.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was an absolutely wonderful talk. And we're going to turn it now to the Q&As. Again, reminder to the audience to submit it to the Q&A function. If you send it to a chat, we probably won't really see it, and we'll just probably direct you to the Q&A function. And the first one is actually going to be from a fellow professor here at Cornell. And Patrick, I encourage you to actually open up the Q&A function, because a lot of these questions are quite long and I don't give justice by saying the whole thing first time over. So it would help if you had it open too. And I'm just going to repeat them also for as a formality for the audience. So the first one again comes from Magnus here at Cornell, and it says, "Thanks for the very interesting talk. I wonder if Thai manners were also described in these manuals in explicit contrast with other people, such as neighboring nations or hill tribes that may have been described as lacking manners or having poor manners. Were the Thai manners held up as a mark of Thai superiority, or if not, were other people manners mentioned in other ways?"
Okay, good question. It's like 200 years, right? So I've got to kind of condense that into a couple of minutes answer. But what I would say is and the book, what the book is about is this debate between the courtly class and the bourgeois class. So it's quite an internal debate, okay? No one cares about hill tribes, okay? They don't even think about them. Occasionally you get some references to Chinese, and Chinese are seen to be not very civilized. But it's a class debate. It's not seen in cultural terms. It's a class debate. I think that in the from the 1960s, where you get the national education system starts to take over the role of inculcating this kind of conservative role of good manners to the nation as a whole. Okay, then hill tribes and other ethnic groups sort of drawn into the education system, and they have to adopt what are referred to as Thai manners. But as I've tried to say, what are Thai manners at this time is a courtly interpretation of the Pudi. It's a class term. It's not really. It's not an ethnic term. So yeah, there's not a great deal of comparison with other Asian societies. Of course, there's comparison with particularly in the early period, with the Europeans, who are seen to be really civilized and good manners. And Japan, occasionally, the Japanese are seen as, particularly on the conservative side of politics, are seen as, because they're loyal to the emperor, and they're seen to be quite disciplined. So there are these occasional references, but it's not the main game at all. The main thing is this debate, this class debate between, as I say, between commoners and Zhao, between Zhao and Pride, commoners and aristocrats.
Thank you, Professor Jory. Next question will be from Tak, and let me read it out. Great talk, Patrick. Did you cover the manners of women during the Pubin nationalistic period, the good manners of citizens versus vis-a-vis the state, state madness, stand up in buses for women and children, stand up for 8 a.m. flag, or the rationalization of manners? Also, to be a civilized Thai is not to be like the unclothed Chinese and not like Africans, which was prompted by the dialogue between Nai Man, Nai Kong.
Yeah, thank you, Ajahn Tak. I saw you say hello. Thank you very much for coming to the talk. Yes, I do mention the gender dimension of manners quite a bit in the book, but I see it in terms of this overall shift from the figure of the aristocrat to the figure of the Pudi. Okay, so that's the big debate. The debate is about the how anyone from any class can become a Pudi. So the transition is from an aristocratic society to a society dominated by the bourgeois bureaucrat. How does that affect women? The first point to make, as I mentioned in the talk, is that in the national education system, the same manners textbooks are used for girls and boys. So for them, the main emphasis is on that courtly conception of the Pudi. But of course, the transformation affects women differently. And what happens with the sort of decline of aristocratic society, women's roles within courtly society, they often had a really prominent role, goes into decline. And if you look at Si Pandin, Four Reigns, they talk about how women's public role is fading, is starting to disappear. And what happens is that these polygamous households start to disappear, and the monogamous household starts to appear. So women are starting to, so you get all of these guides to household management for women about how to manage the household, how to please their husband, how to support their husband. So what you see is basically the transition from the courtly lady to the household, to the housewife. So there is a manners literature on this transition that is discussed quite a lot. But even in books like, and I talk about a very famous novel, Bansai Tong, which has been one of the most famous novels made into umpteen TV series and movies. I think it was a stage play at one time. It's about this commoner, Pochaman, right? She thinks she's a commoner, and she goes to live in she has some distant relatives who are apparently a noble family, and she gets treated terribly by these relatives. She goes there because she wants to be, she's going to one of the schools there, so she needs a place to stay, and they treat her terribly. They treat her like a serf. So the real debate is not about her gender, it's about her status as pariah, as a commoner. And she's treated so badly by the Pudi. So it's part of this debate about the Pudi. You mentioned about people in Songkrams, the cultural mandates, what are they called? The Watan, it slipped my mind. The not Rataniyong, the cultural mandates. So everyone makes fun of them. Everyone makes fun of them. You know, you can't chew betel anymore. You've got to wear a hat. You've got to wear, you know, nice clothes. Women that can't wear the patung anymore. You've got to wear a nice skirt and a blouse. You've got to kiss your wife before you go to work. You know, the man has to kiss his husband, his wife before he goes to work. You know, so that I think you know, people is ridiculed for these you know, kind of conservative styles and manners. In fact, all of this stuff is talked about decades before. Okay, the big difference is that he uses the bureaucracy to mandate these things for the whole country. But all of this stuff is talked about really from the early decades of the 20th century, and talked about in a very progressive way, actually, for the time. It's this transition, as I say, from a courtly mode of conduct to a more bourgeois middle class form of conduct. And all people does is get the power of the state to enforce it, as we know, not very successfully. But these ideas, these teachings were already talked about long before that, and usually by the more progressive side of politics. So I'm a bit more sympathetic to Field Marshal Pibun than a lot of people are.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question we're going to have is from, I assume it's Eric White, but it's showing up for me as White Eric, but I'm just going to put my imposition that I think it's probably switched around for your real name. But his question is, do we have any reliable data on the number of these manuals produced decade by decade, the number printed by author and edition, who the reading audience was, and how widespread they traveled socially and territorially? I'm curious to what degree the ideologies of manners and conduct contained within these manuals spread through reading versus other modes of transition, learning, and socialization, such as oral discourse, performative mimicry, interpersonal instruction, and the like.
It's a good question. We do, because we know the print runs, and some of them have, you know, again, it's 200 years, okay, so I can't, it's difficult to summarize, but in the early decades of the 20th century, these print runs sometimes 9,000, 10,000, you know, or more. So they're getting big print runs. They are in the education system, which is, you know, expanding at this time. There are classes on Janya Siksa, you know, conduct, basically. They have conduct classes in which these books are textbooks that you have to learn. So look, so I think, but obviously initially it's directed at the Karachagan. That's the main focus. The you know, the bureaucracy, the royal officials, and people sort of in and around those groups. So in the, obviously focus on Bangkok and the major, you know, urban centres in the other parts of the kingdom. Not much beyond that, okay? It changes over time. In the book, I try to show how the target groups also change over time. Also, I think it's not, I try not to suggest that, oh, the manners book says this, so everybody changes and you know, follows that form of behaviour. What it really reflects is, as I said, these relations of interdependence. That in order that you know, the courtly class and these bourgeois bureaucrats, they're in each other's faces, okay? And there's all these kind of conflicts, and there's all the literature of the early decades of the 20th century where you can see there are complaints, particularly of the behaviour of the aristocracy, but also the behaviour of these bourgeois bureaucrats who always seem to be very ambitious, very rude. So these forms of behaviour are, you know, they're being modified by this interaction, by this interdependence between these two social groups. And the manners manuals are a kind of a reflection, if you like, of these relations of interdependence that have taken place as a result of, you know, the labour reforms that I talked about earlier on. So that's a short answer, Eric. It's a great question. I do get into a bit more detail in the book, I think, which explains that in a bit more detail.
Thank you, Patrick. The next question is from Mujalin. I think you already touched on gender roles a lot, but nevertheless, let me read you the question and then see what else do you want to maybe clarify on this subject. Thank you for sharing your inspiring project with us. I have a question about the notion of pudi in relation to gender. The English translation you gave for this term is gentle person, which is gender neutral. However, in the very first picture of the Thai military you shown us, you translated as a gentleman. You also touch on the gender aspect a bit by saying that perspective discourses about mannerism and conduct initially targeted men. This point is fascinating for me because my first instinct is that these days Thai women get more pressured into having good manners than their male counterparts. I wonder if you can talk a bit more about the transition. How does the male figure embody the idea of mannerism, and how does the figure of pudi becomes more gender neutral and include the female figure?
Yeah, the initial target of the manners books, manuals, are male bureaucrats, okay? So for the first sort of three decades, it's for men. And if we were looking at that period, we would say qualities of a gentleman. But pudi, as we know, it's gender neutral. And pretty soon you get the same kinds of prescriptions of behaviour for both male students and female students in classrooms. There's no difference. And in fact, again, the time period is very important. But if you look at one book by Kun Ying Duttadi Mala, the wife of Bin Malagun, Mariat Lemnoy, A Little Book of Manners, I think published in 1960. It's absolutely gender neutral. I think there's only one section where she says, I think in a royal audience, male and female Karachagan, they rank takes precedence over gender. So if you have a higher bureaucratic rank, then you go first in the procession, something like that. So actually, the manners manuals, don't, for the most part, distinguish between male and female. As I keep sort of saying, the main debate is about class. It's about this concept of the pudi, and whether you're a woman or a man, it's apart from some relatively minor differences, and I think that changes later. But for the period of the book where the book is most focused, it's a class debate. And if you look at Kuning Duttadi Mala's description of pudi, she talks about the supap sadri, supap rut. The definition is exactly the same. So that's why the gender dimension is not as powerful as I think it does later become. I think you are right that these prescriptions of good behaviour target women are expected to have better behaviour. That's true, but the actual instructions are gender neutral. One other point, if I could make about gender, is that most, I think, most of the major writers on manners, certainly I think from the 40s, 50s, 60s, are women. It seems to become an area, and I do talk about this in the book, it becomes an area where particularly aristocratic women take a lot of interest. And I think the reason is I think they are much more affected by the transition to a kind of a bourgeois society, because they don't have the same kind of work role that males do. And so they kind of, in a way, that their sense of identity loss is quite acute. The loss of their elite, noble status is quite acute, and they try and make up for it, I think, by focusing on the importance of good manners. Because okay, they may not be, Jiao might not mean anything anymore, but they know the ways of the Jiao, they know the ways of courtly society, and I talk about that in the book in quite some detail, but it's certainly true that women, for these reasons, I think, take a great interest in manners literature. But again, it's not so much directed, gender is there, but as I say, the main debate is about class.
Thank you for the clarification of the gender element. It's extremely interesting. The next question I have is from a fellow Cornellian as well, Christopher Miller. He's an ethnomusicologist involved with Javanese gamelan. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. And that's sort of where his question comes from. And he's curious about, sorry, it's like a two-part. How much do musicians and other performing artists figure in the manuals and the historical analysis that you present? And then a bit more context. He's thinking of musicians and other performing artists within the court culture. How are they invested in manners? He's also aware of King, again, sorry if I mispronounced this, Bhumipol's involvement in jazz, which perhaps complicates the picture.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And you're right that King Bhumipol's involvement in jazz complicates the picture, because he starts off as a modern guy. He starts off really as a kind of, as a sort of a progressive Pudi guy, King Bhumipol. Later on he becomes, he like everything, becomes much more courtly, much more conservative. But actually the question of performing arts is very interesting, because everyone knows Thai dancing, right? Thai dancing. So it becomes, and this is actually, I get this from Adan her name slips my mind. Someone can might perhaps remind me. Anyway, she wrote a very good article on the popularity of Thai dancing in Ajahn Parita, the anthropologist, wrote a great article on Thai dancing, in the rise of Thai dancing in the 1970s, or the rising interest in Thai dancing in the 70s on the part of the middle class. And I kind of give it sort of a slightly different take. What I think is, and Kukri Bramor is one of the key guys to revive what's seen as a sort of a dying courtly art form, right? Dancing. It wasn't originally called Thai dancing, it was just classical dancing. But then with everything, it gets this conservative gloss from the 1960s. It becomes Thai dancing, but it's not really Thai dancing. It's courtly dancing. Okay, it's the courtly form. The middle class people. It's another example of what Elias calls the the courtisation of the bourgeois class. Middle class people, they want to become more courtly, and one of the ways they can do it is sign their their sons and daughters up for a Thai dancing class, and it becomes really popular. It's a big thing in the about 60s, particularly the 70s and 80s, and it's an example, I would argue, kind of in the framework that I'm using, of a middle class that wants to, and is attracted to the habitus of the courtly class represented in Thai classical dancing. If anyone's seen sort of Thai classical dancing corn, the movement's so slow, and it's very highly stylized, a high degree of control of the body. This is really straight out of courtly society. It's another example, I would say, of the way that a declining aristocracy is trying to preserve its habitus by, in effect, kind of selling it really to the middle class. So I hope I answered the question. It's a great question. I discuss it a bit in the book, but Barita Chulen Pavgoan and Takun, she's quite a long name. She's written about this in quite some detail.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating. And the next question will be also related to particular practices. But before we go into the next question, it's wonderful to see so much of enthusiasm from our audience. We have questions coming in, but we also need to be mindful of time, because we know that some people in Australia and Southeast Asia might have other commitments in their early morning day. So we normally see a drop of the audience after 9:30. We will try to answer a couple more questions by then, and would need to maybe, unfortunately, leave other questions unanswered. So let me move to the next one. It comes from Daud Ali. I hope I pronounced the name correct. And it goes, Thank you for a very interesting talk. Elias' conception of courtesaning manners focuses ordainedly on table manners because the royal feast was an event of great sociability. From my vantage point in India studies, the discourse on manners rarely focused on eating because eating was not conceived as a collective and social activity among aristocrats until the arrival of Islam. In your talk, along the red perspective in manuals on manners, and I think this is topics, do the topics change?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. You're right. I think that table manners only becomes important, during the colonial period, where they've got to learn how to use knives and forks, because the Thais, along with other Southeast Asians, tend to use their hands. The Europeans, they see this, as we know, as sort of uncivilized. But one thing I should say, actually, the Europeans, the colonial class, the way I see this is like a super bourgeois class. Okay, so normally you have the aristocracy at the top, then you've got a bourgeois class here. Here you have the European colonial class as a kind of a super bourgeois class, and the Thai aristocracy, they're in a relationship of interdependence, to use that Eliasian idea, with the colonial class. So when they go to have their dinner functions, they're going to learn how to use the napkin and the table manners. So I talk about that a little bit, but how many Thais ever get to have a dinner party with Europeans? Hardly any. So I don't think it's a really important part of it. And in the Thai manners manuals, there's not a great deal of emphasis on eating manners. The emphasis is somewhere else. One thing I would say, it's a really interesting question, the emphasis, and it changes over time. But what I would say, when I give this paper to Europeanists, which are basically everyone over here, they always talk about language. And in the Thai thing, language is actually quite a minor, maybe not minor, but it is less emphasized than body. The Thai discourse on manners is really heavily influenced by how you comport yourself. It really is. And for a long time, I wondered why this was the case. And just the way you hold your face, smiling. Another thing I forgot to mention with the gender question: women should smile. Thailand, land of smiles. It doesn't come from nowhere. This is where it comes from. You've got to have a sort of a pleasant visage. You sort of, when you're walking, you stoop a little bit when you're around, your superiors. All this kind of, it's very, very prescriptive, down to the hand movements, the body movements, all this kind of thing. And you can sort of see the effects of this teaching, just in people's, as I say, in people's habitus. But why is the focus on the body? And I think it's because of the preponderance of the courtly style. Because although I do have a section where I talk a lot about language, but it's, as I say, it's more about the body. I think it's the preponderance of the courtly style, because in courtly society, only one person speaks. It's the king or the prince, and you listen. But you need to listen in the right way. You need to have your body right. You need to sit right. You need to prostrate yourself right. That is the way that you communicate your status vis-a-vis the prince. And as I said, courtly society is always preoccupied with status, and the way you communicate it is predominantly through the body. And so I think that's not to say that there's no advice on speaking. There is, but it's secondaries I think by comparison to, particularly, there's a big sociolinguistics literature on manners in the Western context, and I didn't find it actually very helpful for this particular project, just because, as I said, I don't think the speech is the main emphasis.
Great, and thank you again for everyone's enthusiasm, but I think we're going to have this as the last question of the night, and it comes from a Miss Kanjana. Again, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. So that's a great point about the Rathanium, I'm so sorry, the Pibung Songkram region didn't need to invent the wheel. How do you see the Siamese Thai concept of Mariyat similar to respectability politics? Is the comparison helpful to our understanding of Thai Mariyat? And another follow-up, can you share your views on how the concept of Marriott is being applied to the unruly students who are protesting today?
Yeah, I think there are two things here. Firstly is the conduct. Secondly is the language. I don't think the language is very important. Whether you call it Marriott or you call it Janya, you call it Iriabot, whatever, Jariya, there are all these Thai words for it. The term Marriott actually starts to, I think it really starts to, it appears in the 1920s, and it's only I think in the 1960s where it becomes used much more often. Doesn't mean to say it's a completely new form of behaviour. It just that word, for whatever reason, starts to get used a bit more. Prior to that, the word Janya or Jariya, which is more about conduct and has much more of a Buddhist ring to it, is the one that is used. And I think that suggests, obviously, it suggests that conduct was an area where Buddhism, in the past, was the major provided the discourse on this thing. And one of the things I talk about in the book is secularization. So during this period where they're developing the concept of the Pudi, they're also setting up this new modern education system, and Buddhism is kind of having a declining role, including in the terms of the language terms that are used to describe this. So I guess what my book is about is really the equivalent of the gentleman and the lady and the gentleman. European case, I would say the Thai Pudi is kind of like the equivalent of the gentleman and lady, which is the product, I would argue, of the same kind of process that took place in Europe, which took place in Thailand a little bit later on. You mentioned the second part of your question is about what's happening now, and I think that's a fascinating question. One of the frustrations of being a historian is that you always get asked questions about what's happening now, or even worse, what's going to happen in the future. And I kind of tend to refuse to answer the questions about the future because there's no way of knowing. It's just guess, and I think, why waste your time guessing? But I think it is a good question about what's happening now. And I think I sort of intimated it in my answer. That is, I think that the concept of the Pudi is breaking down. It is breaking down for all of the reasons that I mentioned in that brief section at the end of the talk. The kind of globalization of the Thai economy, the expansion of a middle class outside the bureaucracy, and the integration of the rural and urban working class. That's a really important thing, and you can sort of see it in so many different ways. And people kind of, for example, you never heard people say "gulmung" in Thai dramas, right? Gulmung, it's like a very impolite form of pronoun. You, I, you. You never used to, or hardly ever used to hear it. Now you hear it all the time. It's kind of this informalization process that Reid talks about. So. Like I said, I really think it's kind of like a social revolution in the school, in the education system now. Everyone knows the education system, although I spend a lot of time in it, so I've got a lot of friends in it, and good people, well-meaning people, but we know it's extremely conservative, and you cannot reform it under the monarchy. You just cannot, really. And a lot of people probably wouldn't like me saying that. You just can't reform it. So the students are rebelling against it, and one of the the rebellion, one of the expressions of rebellion is in forms of manners, like the haircuts, right? Haircuts, such a big thing. What other country in the world would having a short haircut be a sort of a symbol of resistance? Back during the Qing dynasty, when the Chinese nationalists cut off their queue. This is kind of like it's 100 years later. And it's a big thing in the schools. It just shows you how conservative it is in the schools. And I think they've just had enough. They've had enough. They're all on social media, that they understand the world outside. They understand how backward it is in the education system. And there's a real, as I say, it's a rebellion going on. And where it leads to, I don't know. But to me, it's all got to do with the breakdown of the Pudi. I think the Pudi concept is over. I talk about it in the book actually. When King Bhumibol died, he was the Pudi par excellence, I think. And if you look at his son, right, that guy is not a Pudi by any stretch of the imagination. If you look at, Brem was a Pudi, he's gone. If you think about people like Anand Banyara Chun, even someone like Abhisit Wechachiwa, all these guys, they take on the persona of the Pūdi. They're useless. You know, they've got no real influence in Thai politics anymore. And by contrast, you have these kind of gangsters. You know, the king, he's a gangster. Look at the prime minister, he's a gangster. You have this kind of people with really bad behaviour because the Pūdi, it's lost its exemplary function. So that's a kind of long-winded way to answer your very interesting question.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time, Patrick. That was a wonderful, again, lecture and Q&A. And so for those who want to be able to see next week's lecture, as this is a repeating series, just a reminder, next week is going to be at 12:40 EST because we do have a US speaker, Miss Megan C. Knott, who's also going to be actually on Thailand. So it's great to have both kind of having the country back to back, both from your perspective and then someone from a gender sexuality background studying as well. So again, thank you so much for your time. You can reach out to cgatty@cornell.edu if you want to be added to the listserv and be able to see all our upcoming amazing lecturers. And as can be believed, we have many amazing lecturers just like Mr. Patrick Jory here. So again, thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your morning, evening, whatever time of the day it may be for you.
Thank you so much for inviting me, and thanks everyone for listening in.